The idea that the United States could accuse another country of excessive force and corruption was mind-boggling. I wish I had time to show you Minister Louis Farrakhan's response to Mike Wallace on 60 Minutes. I wish I could channel the passionate indignation that he had when what Mike Wallace suggested there was a country that was corrupt. Farrakhan said, "The United States should keep its mouth shut." As much hell as the U.S. has raised on this earth, spilled blood on every continent, millions of Native Americans to the atomic bomb at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, hundreds of thousands killed in the Mideast, including 500,000 children who were starved to death for political reasons. Death squads in Latin America, dictatorships for decades, torture and rendition to this day, drones against civilians in violation of international law, meddling in support for coups in Venezuela, Honduras, Ecuador, Uruguay, Nicaragua, the list goes on. Clearly, this government has no right to speak to any other government on the face of the earth. There is no one more corrupt and no one that denies public assembly and exhibits violence against its citizens more than those in the United States. Just look. Just look at the attacks on Black Lives Matter or just black citizens every day. Just look at the attacks and the violations of free speech against multiple Occupy movements or labor actions in this region. There is no more violent or corrupt government on the face of the earth, and this is what Farrakhan said, but this is what I'm saying. There is more greater threat to world peace and human development than the United States. The executive order is just one more action, just one more small example of U.S. intervention in Venezuela, Latin America, and it parallels U.S. intervention in the Ukraine, the Mideast, and elsewhere. Response number 2. I only had 2. As a researcher in international communication who closely follows Latin America, global media, and political and social change in the region, my study, including several research trips, interviews with media workers, officials, and participants in missions in Venezuela, and a close reading of international press coverage, I would say Venezuela is not a threat. Venezuela may be a threat of a good example. The threat of a good example. And I notice that others agree. UNASUR, the Union of South American Nations, voted unanimously to condemn the executive order. 33 nations at the Summit of the Americas, blocked only by Canada and the US. 33 nations said withdraw that executive order. More than 10 million Venezuelans have signed a petition saying withdraw the executive order. Do you know that even the director of US National Intelligence will not describe Venezuela as a threat? The US has tried to walk it back, saying it's just standard language, but there's still 100 embassy workers in Venezuela working with the opposition against democracy. The threat in this hemisphere is US intervention, US interference. You want good examples? You want hope? Look at some of the accomplishments. ABC News reported that nutrition has doubled in the last decade in Venezuela. UNICEF reports that infant mortality has been reduced by 1/3. The Guardian newspaper reports extreme poverty has been reduced by 74%. UNESCO reports that Venezuela was illiteracy-free as of 2005. In fact, the literacy rate is greater in Venezuela than in the United States. You want an example? They've built 13 universities in Venezuela in the last 15 years, 30 million people. You know what they've done in the 38 million population of California? They've built 22 prisons. 13 universities, 22 prisons. Who should we be afraid of? The Economist reports support for democracy in Venezuela is the highest in Latin America. because they have a sense, this is The Economist, quote, that the government is acting on behalf of everyone rather than the privileged few. There's more. There's so much more that we don't know. And as a professor of communication and global media, I recognize it's not our fault. We get limited information provided by the commercial media. I ask, wouldn't it be great to get some information that was not distorted, that was not filtered, that was not framed by government sources and the ideology of neoliberalism, by the New York Times, Fox News, ABC? Well, tonight we have the opportunity. Thanks to Dr. Felix Massoud, who arranged the facilities here. Thanks to the local committee, Chicago Stands with Venezuela, that invited our speaker and sponsored this forum. We have an opportunity to circumvent the media filter and that frame. Tonight we have a guest who can provide firsthand account, documented evidence of the progress, a political economic overview of the conditions faced in Venezuela, and discuss some policies to address both problems and opportunities. Our guest speaker, Maximilien Sanchez Arvelaiz, has been serving as the charge d'affaires of the Embassy of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela to the United States since last July. He was appointed ambassador to the United States in February of 2014. He has not taken that position due to some dispute with the U.S. government. He served as Commissioner in International Relations from 2013 to 2014 for President Maduro. He was the ambassador to Brazil from 2010 to 2013, where he received a Medal of the Order of Rio Branco for distinguished diplomatic service. He was the Minister Counselor for the Venezuelan mission to the United Nations from 2006 to 2007. Ambassador Sanchez is a lawyer with a master's degree in Latin American political science from the University Pantheon in Paris, and he did his postgraduate study in political science at the University in London. He joined President Hugo Chavez's government as a consultant in foreign affairs, and then served as a senior advisor to the Office of the Presidency for two periods, 2004 to 6 and 2007 to 2010. Contributed to several international magazines, including Le Monde Diplomatique and Folha de Sao Paulo, among others, where his writing on politics in Latin America is regularly published. In other words, our speaker tonight is well-versed, experienced, and has the authority of an active participant and leader in the Venezuelan government. Please join me in welcoming Ambassador Maximilien Sanchez Arvelaiz.
Thank you very much. So I don't have your voice, you know. That's going to be a problem.
I don't either.
Use a microphone.
Yeah, actually, I was quite impressed. I was thinking, my God, now I'm going to speak. How, you know, it's not easy. No microphone. I hope you can hear me. Yes, is it okay?
No.
Well, let's see. I will try my best. But again, I was quite impressed. You know, I said to myself, yeah, I should learn more from Professor Technique, you know. So thank you very much to be here tonight. This is my first time in Chicago, I have to say. And it's funny because they told me it's windy and it's raining, and it is true. It's true. You know, Professor, when you responded to a certain question, I was reading my little notes, and I said to myself, my God, but you are saying everything I was going to say. So yes, I'm going to start to talk about myself, maybe, a little bit. For nearly 10 years, almost 10 years, I've been very lucky and privileged to work closely to President Chavez. And then in 2010, I was appointed as ambassador in Brazil. I worked there for 3 years. But I mentioned that because, yes, I was privileged to be a witness and to follow all the changes that have been taking place in Latin America for the last 10 years or 15 years, since 1999. All this process, all the changes for the better that took place in our continent. So I was in Brazil for 3 years, and then President Chavez passed away in 2013, and I went back to Caracas to work with President Maduro. And then last year, I still remember, I was having a conversation with my president, and we were talking about the United States and how important, that we start to improve the relations and find the right balance in our conversation with the United States. And we're thinking, okay, we should do something about it. And then a couple of days later, I received a phone call from my president. He told me, oh, Maximilien, I've been thinking, I think we should go there. So I said, okay. So usually our diplomats, when they go to the United States, they don't stay very long, So I said, okay, it's going to be a challenge. So I arrived here in July last year, and I can tell you that's been not an easy job for the last 8-9 months. But then one day I woke up and I read in the news that my country, Venezuela, has become a national threat to the United States. It is something, Wow. Then I start to look at the list of the countries that being as well shown as national threat to the United States, and I think there's 9 or 10 countries, I think. And usually it doesn't end very well for those countries. So I was thinking, wow, I represent a national threat to the United States. And I always thought to myself, but no, Venezuela is hope. We are trying to build something different, But then, yes, I have to say that a few couple of days before the summit of Panama, that was in April. Have you been following what took place in Panama? That it was the first real summit of the Americas, of America, because we were all invited, including Cuba for the first time. It was a big event. And also, it was very interesting to see that almost all the presidents that took part of the summit, they all said to President Obama, come on, Venezuela, it can't be a threat to the United States. I have to say that a couple of days before the summit, actually, President Obama did recognize that Venezuela was not a threat. We need to take into account that. But then obviously nobody paid very much attention to that summit. There was, I think it took place on a Friday and a Saturday, the 10th and the 11th of April. And that Sunday is when Hillary Clinton tweeted that she was going to be candidate. And also it was on the same day that Game of Thrones launched the 5th season. So that wasn't on the news, nobody paid attention to that one day before, you have all the countries of the hemisphere in Panama talking about the future of the continent. And also, yes, that for the first time you have in the same room a president of Cuba and the president of the United States, quite a big thing. And also, yes, that nobody could understand how come we can say that Venezuela is a threat. So we've been discussing, and I've been discussing to my government, to the president, how we have become a threat, and all these things. But yes, no, I believe Venezuela is we are continuing. There's a microphone coming. So, few headlines that you might never heard about Venezuela, you might never read about Venezuela in the mainstream media, even in my country. As the Professor Lee said, illiteracy was eradicated in Venezuela. Extreme poverty was cut now to 5%, while poverty fell to 25%. 95% of Venezuelan people today eat 3 times per day. There was a picture on that presentation you have there from the La FAO, the World Food Organization, giving President Maduro an award about that. Today, Venezuela, here we are in a university. Today, Venezuela has the second highest college enrollment in the region. Housing increased by 40%. The number of senior citizens receiving pensions more than tripled. Social investment increased to about 2/3 of government spending. But yes, we do believe that we are a threat. We have in 15 years more than 19 elections. Every year there's an election in Venezuela. And we're going to have a new election before the end of this year, parliament elections. Last year we have local elections, yeah. Then the year before we have presidential elections, governor elections, again presidential elections, because when President Chavez was elected. I mean, every year. It is a problem sometimes to govern, because every year we get elections, we need to mobilize, to work. But yeah, we never talk about that, about all these things in Venezuela. When I arrived here in the United States, I've been doing some research. How can I explain to my friends here about what's going on in Venezuela? And I think to some extent, it's a combination with the New Deal, President Roosevelt in the 30s, last century. Economic and social inclusion is what we've been trying to do in Venezuela. And also, to some extent, the civil rights movement in the 60s, also from last century. Political inclusion. So I believe that what took place in Venezuela, what is taking place in Venezuela for the last 10 years, is a combination of these two historical movements that we went through here in this amazing country. Civil rights movement. For the first time in Venezuela, you have the vast majority of our people that before they were regarded as second-rank citizens, that suddenly now they have become full citizens with rights, but also duties and obligations. And nowadays, if you have the opportunity to go to Venezuela, you will find an amazing society where all the sectors of the population, higher, middle, lower classes, working classes, everybody is engaged, committed, talking about politics. When you think that in our last local elections, the turnaround was around 80% to elect a mayor. 80% people get mobilized. And I'm saying that because in Venezuela, it is not compulsory to go to vote. So that's what's important. And political and social inclusion, and economic and social inclusion, and I refer to the New Deal, because, what I said just before, all this amazing social progress that we've been through. Again, because political willingness. So that's quite important. And so we've been deepening democracy with the participation of the people. We've been democratizing the communication. They always talk here about the lack of freedom of speech, the lack of freedom of expression in Venezuela, and on the contrary. So I was talking about deepening democracy. In Venezuela, for the first time, we've been discussing and voting our constitution that took place in 2000. For nearly 6 months, everybody, you could go everywhere in Caracas, in all the country, people were discussing our new constitution. And then we went to a referendum that was in December 2000. And for the first time, we've been able to vote for our constitution. That was an important moment. And in our constitution, we talk about democracia participativa, participatory democracy, and the idea that in order to take decisions, we need to have the participation of all the citizens. Another very important, as I mentioned before, the democratization of communication. Again, if, there are two Venezuela, one virtual, particularly in internet and in the mainstream media, and the real Venezuela when you go there. And that's quite important. That's quite amazing, that there's two different Venezuela. And yes, for the first time, you got some of sectors of the Venezuelan population that they get access to the media. That the media they don't talk only about one sector of the population, but they talk about all the Venezuelan society. Another point, regaining sovereignty. Thanks to the Bolivarian Revolution, we've been able to rediscover our nation. Where do we come from? President Chavez was a wonderful teacher, a wonderful pedagogue. He was an historian. And what always amazed me from him, that he was able to look the past and our history in order to move forward. That was very important. And I think this idea to rediscover the nation, it was being characterized most of the process that has been taking place in Latin America in the last 10 years. Not only in Venezuela, but in Ecuador, in Bolivia, to some extent in Brazil, in Argentina. People start to be proud of our history and where we come from. That's something that I believe President Chavez was one of the first to show us that. And because I mentioned this idea of Bolivar, obviously another very important concept that we've been fighting for and promoting is the idea of regional integration and solidarity. When you imagine how was Venezuela and Latin America 15 years ago, 20 years ago, and where we are now, we got UNASUR, CELAC, Mercosur, ALBA, Petrocaribe. And I have to say that most of these important new forum or regional bodies, Venezuela was one of the key players in their creation and their promotion. So that's something quite new. And I believe that's one of the reasons why, for example, when President Baba goes to Panama, well, you have to listen, all these presidents showing solidarity to Venezuela and saying this continent had changed, Obviously, we are all very pleased about what's taking place right now between the United States and Cuba, very important. But we believe that also that's a result of all the changes that have been taking place in our continent in the last 10, 15 years. So, as I've been saying, that we've been through an important social transformation and political as well in Venezuela. And what is important that there's elections, as I said, every year. But a bit like during the civil rights movement here, you have some sectors of the society, of the population, that for them is very difficult to accept this kind of change and to realize that, yes, you've got also the vast majority of the people that want to be part of the society. And sometimes you got a kind of violent reaction with that. So, in 2002, you had a coup against my government, against President Chavez, that did last only for a few days. That was in April 2002. And thanks to an amazing mobilization from the army and from the people, President Chavez was back. And from time to time, you got some people that, you know, they cannot accept the result of the polls, the result of the elections, and they try something, you know. So, for example, last year we went through a very difficult moment. I believe some people thought that when President Chavez died, that was going to be the end of the Bolivarian Revolution. You know, a strong leader, very charismatic, died. How can we carry on, you know? It's impossible. So we have to remember that a couple of months after his death, we have a presidential elections. President Maduro was elected. It was a difficult elections because we were all, you know, recovering from the death of President Chavez. It was a difficult moment for the Venezuelans, for my country. And when you go to election, usually you go, you know, with a kind of fighting spirit, you know, and a kind of, but, you know, we were, yes, recovering, you know, in luto. And then, so the result was, again, Maduro was elected with, I think, 51% of the vote against 49. It's a kind of result you will find in any European country, for example. But because it is Venezuela, so, oh my God, something fishy took place there, you know. But okay. Then 6 months later, in December 2013, we have the election for mayors, local elections. It's very interesting because at that moment, the Venezuelan opposition decided to transform that local election as a kind of national referendum. This time we're going to show to the people, to the world, that yes, we have the majority. So the election took place in December, and again, huge participation, more than 80%, and the result was 55% of the votes for the PSUV, the party of the Bolivarian Revolution, and 45% for the opposition. And now I don't have the numbers of towns and cities but a large majority went through the party of President Maduro. So again, an important result. And yes, okay, result of the election, that's democracy. A few days later, the result, we have an important meeting that took place in Caracas with President Maduro, where he invited all the new elected mayors, including from the opposition. I was at that meeting, actually, a very interesting meeting where President Maduro said, okay, we got our differences, but let's try to move on and identify areas where we can work together. Because, you know, we've got some problems, that's true, and we need to work all together to resolve them. So that was in December 2013. And then, a few weeks later, suddenly, you have a little tiny group of people from the opposition that decided to go to the street of Caracas, and they decided to stay there until my government resigned. This event took place mainly in the upper classes, middle classes, you know, of Caracas and other places of Venezuela. They were described by the mainstream media as student protests. It was very interesting because I was in Caracas at that moment, and obviously everybody was talking about Kiev in Ukraine and all these events that had been taking place before in Egypt, and you know. So as soon as you got a group of people gathering in a square, they think, oh, a revolution is taking place there, and the government must be very bad. But yes, but that was not exactly the case in Venezuela, because this demonstration was not exactly led by peaceful students. And it was very easy to see that something else was going on at that moment. And yes, a coup was on its way in Venezuela during these days. An attempt to destabilize a government, an attempt to show to the world, look at this government that is repressing all these peaceful students. The point that there was really an attempt to overthrow a legitimate and democratic government. How come? Well, when you think they targeted only public offices, they started to interrupt the validity of the street of Caracas, and in quite a violent manner. And unfortunately, 43 Venezuelan citizens died during these weeks, but including 10 members of the armed forces or security officers. But you see, again, we call that moment la salida, no? The way out. We will stay until the government resigned. And I think that if something like that might take place in any country in the world, including here, obviously the state will react and make sure that the citizen can have a normal life and not to be interrupted and disrupted by a minority of people. And that's what we did. And these 43 people who died, some of them including, they have nothing to do with the demonstrations or whatever. And we all feel very sorry for them. Very sad moment. And yes, you have few leaders, political leaders, that were involved in that coup. And now we have to respond to the Venezuelan justice. Right now, as I'm speaking, you got a couple of women that were in Washington, D.C., and they just received an award from the NED, a kind of prize to fight for democracy and one of these ladies, her husband, was one of the main leaders of this coup last year. I prefer President Maduro to receive an award from the World Food Organization than from the NED. I should mention that more than 3,000 people were arrested during these riots, or whatever we call that, during this coup. And right now, only 39 people are still in jail. And from these 39 people, half of them, they belong to the police or to the armed forces or to the National Guard. Half of them. And there's only one person that we could say is a student. Yes. But again, you will never see that in the New York Times or so it's interesting. Do you know so they present my country as a national state that we don't respect human rights. When you look at our history and where do we come from, you have to remember, for example, in Venezuela, in the 70s, in the 80s, in the 90s, all the violations of human rights that took place. In 1989, we have what we call the Caracazo, February 89, I believe that more than 5,000 people were disappeared, were killed, and most of them by the armed forces. And you didn't have any sanction bill against Venezuela at that moment. You didn't have any executive order against Venezuela at that moment, you know. But yes. So where we are now. Obviously, we are going through some difficult moment. Venezuela is an oil producer country. Nobody could have imagined 6 months ago, 8 months ago, that the price of the barrel of oil will drop from $100 to $40. That's something, you know. Not a good moment to be president or to govern a country that, you know, needs this main income. Because that's the truth, you know, Venezuela is an oil producer. There's nothing we can do about it, you know. So yes, so a difficult moment, but he obliged us to diversify our economy and to be more, let's say, creative. But again, what is it very important? That this year we're going to have a parliament election, and again, is where I believe the vast majority of Venezuelan people want our differences to be resolved through elections, not through violence, through, you know, that's very important. This coming Sunday, on the 17th of May, our opposition, we're going to have primaries. And we are very pleased about that, because they ask our electoral body to organize them. So again, when you read the press and you see the mainstream media, they always say that in Venezuela, you know, we cannot trust the electoral body, the courts, the justice, and yeah, it was, you see, it seems that the Venezuelan opposition sometimes they you know, for them, our electoral body is good only when they win elections, not when they lose. I mean, but it's a good example of democracy. The fact that, you know, primaries will take place, and those who identify themselves with the Venezuelan opposition they're going to be able to elect their candidate for the next elections. And the PSUV, the party of the revolution, I think they're going to have a primaries in June, July, and again, yeah, we will have elections for the end of the year. And we are taking some important measures because we are confronting some difficult moment on the economic front, as I said before, $100, $40, you know. And also, one thing I didn't mention, that yes, we went through also kind of sabotage of our economy. For those who know history, remember what took place in Chile in the early 70s before the coup, you know, to create havoc, chaos, shortages, you know, with this idea that you can identify a socialist country because there's a lot of queue there. Well, it's not exactly that. And definitely you got sectors of the sectors that been working against my government, promoting all these shortages and all this disarray. But we are fighting that, and things are improving. And we believe that in the next few months, we've managed to stabilize the situation. I should mention that Venezuela also has been an important player, as I said, to promote solidarity and integration in all the region. We mentioned Petrocaribe, for example, very important for all our brothers from Haiti and Dominican Republic, Jamaica, you know, and also for Central America. El Salvador judged on Petrocaribe last year. Very important. As you know, some important peace talks are taking place in Colombia right now. And again, Venezuela is very, you know, we are following closely what's taking place there. If everything goes well, we might have a continent free of any armed conflict. Very important. For those who think that promoting the stability in Venezuela, you will have something better, just imagine all the changes that have been taking place in my country. If we don't resolve our differences through elections, through democratic manners, it will be a chaos. It will be very dangerous, not only for Venezuela, but for most of the region. So, yeah, interesting times. I'm very pleased to see that you're interested of what's taking place in my country. I believe now we can have a kind of Q&A moment. But before that, I would like to thank you, Professor Lee, Felix as well, Professor Felix, Stanfield Smith, our consul, Jesus, that has been helping me to promote this event. And let's hope next time when I come back, we're going to have a microphone. I'm losing my voice right now. Don't be surprised about my French accent, because I grew up in France, so it's where I get this silly accent when I was a teenager. And any question, whatever you want to know about my country, I'm here to respond to you.
Let's take a break. I just want to point out that there's some materials in the back from the local Solidarity Committee on Venezuela. I think there's also some things there from the consulate that you're free to look at before you go. Again, I want to thank Dr. Felix Massoud, who is not here, but he asked that we announce, and so I will, because he helped put this together, that on Wednesday, May 20th, in room 254 here at Schmidt, there will be a lecture by Piero Gliesias on Visions of Freedom, a book on Cuba, U.S., and South African foreign policy. Professor Gliesias is from Johns Hopkins University. He's written several books, and this is sponsored by the Department of History, which is who sponsored this event too. So I believe also there's some flyers in the back if you're interested in that. I should just point out that in Chicago there's lots of superstars. I don't know if you noticed that Spike Lee was here today and had a press conference, and he explained about Chirac. One interesting thing to me was he refused to take any questions. But we're not going to do that tonight, even though we have our own star here with the ambassador. We are going to take questions.
But let me think now. If Spike Lee refused to take the... You know why?
He did not take questions.
But you know why? Because since do the right things, he always said that. That if you, no, really, because once I went to one of his talks.
And he wouldn't take your question?
Yeah, of course. And he said, no. Since do the right things, I don't talk anymore.
Okay, so, but we will take questions. But here's how we want to do this, because we have a full room. So we want to make sure that everybody gets an opportunity to ask a question. So you'll get your chance to ask a question, but you don't get your second or third question until everybody has an opportunity to ask their own. I realize that's not an equal time, but our guest speaker gets most of the time, and now we have questions. I'd also would like to take 2 or 3 questions at a time, because oftentimes the questions overlap, so when the response comes, he can respond to all of them. And also there's one more superstar in the U.S. from Chicago, which is Obama. And I think that you've seen the Key and Peele impersonations where he's got Luther, his anger translator. That was kind of my role here tonight. I also will be your question translator. If your question goes on and on and on, I will very civilly interrupt you and translate what you're asking so the speaker can understand what you're asking. So please think carefully, and you have your own voice. You ask your question, but let's have 2 or 3 questions, and then the ambassador will respond. Then we'll take 2 or 3 more, and we'll stay for a decent while. Yes, sir.
Can you translate to the ambassador? I want to thank him for coming here to teach us about Venezuela. Thank you very much.
As Luther? A couple questions. Yeah, let's take a few questions.
So, thank you, Ambassador, for coming. And you talked about the National Endowment for Democracy giving an award to several of the people who were involved last year in the attempted coup. And I remember in 2002, I think it's the first time I remember really hearing about the National Endowment for Democracy because of their role in the coup that year. For those that don't know, the National Endowment for Democracy, the NED, is entirely funded by the United States government, mostly from the State Department. And it includes the Democratic Party, the Republican Party, and unfortunately the AFL-CIO. And as an officer in my union, it's one of the saddest things about labor history that so often the union movement takes the side of U.S. foreign policy, as they did during the coup in 2002. But what I wanted to ask was, can you give us the size of the proportions? How much money is the NED and the other non-governmental organizations, so-called non-governmental organizations from the U.S. spending trying to destabilize things in Venezuela?
Good, thank you. Yes, ma'am.
Solamente quiero hacer una aclaración. Cuando la introducción se realizó, se mencionó que 33 universidades y 21 prisiones. Yo quiero aclarar que las prisiones que se han construido en Venezuela es porque se está modificando el método de atender a los prisioneros.
No, él se refería a 21 prisiones en California.
California.
Sí.
Ajá.
Sí, él estaba comparando Estados Unidos con...
22 prisons were built in California in the last 30 years. 13 universities were built in Venezuela in the last 15.
Okay.
Yes.
I saw in the news recently that Maduro announced that there's going to be nationalizations of food distribution in Venezuela, and I'm just curious, what's the extent of these proposed nationalizations, and how do you think this will combat economic sabotage?
Another question? Somebody was over here. Yes, sir.
Yes, in the map that we saw coming in today, I noticed that there was one part wired out to the election, that was given the elections, Guyana. So I'm curious, as Venezuela attempts to integrate with the Caribbean, particularly CARICOM, how are the relations going with Guyana and what's the future, given that there is still quite a bit of territorial dispute?
Yeah.
So you've got 3 questions?
Yes. Guyana, I'm going to start with Guyana because I believe there was some election taking place.
Just right now.
Yeah. Okay, again. So elections took place in Guyana a couple of days ago, I think, and actually I don't know, I feel very embarrassed. I don't know the result.
They don't know yet either.
Okay. Okay, but whatever the result is, the point that in the previously there was being an attempt to promote a kind of confrontation between Venezuela and Guyana. It's interesting because everything started when Guyana got its independence. And just a couple of years before the independence, which year it was? In the independence of Guyana?
70s.
In the 70s. I thought it was in the 60s. But just before, a couple of years before, we have this decision in a court, I think in the UK. I mean, this controversy about between Venezuela and Guyana. And at that time, it was really this idea to confront this young nation, Guyana, to Venezuela as a kind of, let's say, I mean, they were regarding us as the imperialist ones, you know. It was interesting that with Prince Chavez, yes, there's this controversy, and that's being dealt at the UN. I think there's, I don't know the name exactly, but there is an appointed person by the General Secretary who follow this controversy. But we've been trying to promote a reintegration with Guyana, and our relation with the previous, the current the last government and the previous ones, and have been excellent. And Guyana is part of UNASUR and part of all these regional integration, and we support that. And there's no way that people could say, do you know who always promote this idea that Venezuela is against Guyana? The right wing in Venezuela, the opposition. It's quite interesting, actually. But, and I'm sure that whatever the result is, we will carry on this process of integration. And yes, that controversy, that matter will be discussed where it should be discussed, but not in a confrontational manner or whatever. No? So, yeah. The question about nationalization of food. Distribution, yes. Difficult to nationalize food. You know, Venezuela used to import 80% of what we consume. Again, that's part of the price to pay when you are oil producer. At the end of the day, it's always cheaper to import than to produce. Venezuela in the late 19th century was, I would say, was producing cocoa and coffee, and then a couple of decades later, and even tobacco, they discovered oil. That was in the 1914 or 19, and we became a huge field of oil producer with derricks. And you know, Venezuela became one of the most important oil producers in the world, founding member of OPEC in the 60s. And yes, and as I mentioned to you, it became very cheap to import and not to produce. And the consequences in Venezuela was terrible because we didn't have any more the culture and agriculture, peasant, we don't produce anything. And you have all this migration from the land to the cities, you know. So we got another problem in Venezuela, that things are cheaper than most of our neighbors. So you have to understand that most of the projects that you get in Venezuela, you will pay sometimes 30, 40, 50% less than in Colombia or in Brazil. So an attractive job to do in Venezuela is to be a smuggler, you know, and to buy food in Venezuela, and you take it to your neighbors, okay? And recently we have discovered that 30% of what we import in Venezuela end up in Colombia. Because whatever we do, it's cheaper. It will still be cheaper in Colombia to get something from Venezuela than. So that's a real problem. So when President Maduro is talking about nationalization, he's talking about, yes, trying to find the best way to guarantee that the vast majority of the people can get access to food. Because that's the other thing that, yes, we got some problems, But on the other hand, as I said to you before, according to the World Food Organization from the UN, Venezuela now, we don't have any more hunger. Okay, that's very important to understand. So right now, President Maduro, that's the main battle we are having in Venezuela, is to guarantee to the people access to the food. And we are talking about, when you say nationalization, we are talking about to establish a network to facilitate the distribution. But again, we are not against the private sector. That's something very important to understand. It's not that we don't want anymore the private sector to produce or to, the private sector has its part in our economy. And it's going to be like that. But yes, we want to make sure that the state can guarantee to the people access to their needs. And that's the reason we are talking about establishing a network of distribution. More question? There was a first one, but the LED. But that kind of question, I don't know what to answer because I think we need to wait 50 years to see. Yes, from the when they open the files and classified, or maybe less than 50 years actually. Yes, but so I don't know right now how much through the NED USAID the Venezuelan position has been receiving. But I'm sure you can find the answer.
Let's take a few more questions. There actually, NED has their own website, and you can see at least what they publicly report on how much aid that they've given for democratic promotion in Venezuela, and it's in the tens of millions. But you can, at least that's part of it that they will share. I'm sure there's more.
That's just one of the NGOs.
Yes, yes. Questions?
The Latin American Herald Tribune is reporting that there are negotiations taking place right now in Caracas between the U.S. and Venezuela to unblock you as ambassador, and to take away the executive order that that puts sanctions on Venezuela, and to reduce the number of U.S. diplomats in Caracas. Is that correct reporting? Do you know what the results are of those negotiations so far, or what's happening?
Okay. Yes, way back.
Hello. I know you discussed the solidarity with the Caribbean, and you mentioned the summit, so I would like you to discuss a little bit more your solidarity with Puerto Rico and Puerto Rico's present political concerns.
There was one? Yes.
Yeah, I was just going to say that I think what the United States is doing against Venezuela is very serious. Just in the same way they're trying to attempt to do the same thing with Cuba through these negotiations. And one of the things that, to me, that they're trying to do is drive a wedge between Cuba and Venezuela. And I don't think either country is falling for it, because it's to Venezuela's credit, you're still sending oil to Cuba. Yet, you have an economic crisis in your country, so that's very important that that's being done. And I know that in Cuba, 6 days after the U.S. Put the sanctions on Venezuela, Cuba held a solidarity conference with Venezuela. So what the United States is trying to do to divide your countries is not working, in my opinion.
3 great questions for somebody that does diplomacy. U.S. Venezuelan relations, Puerto Rico, Venezuela, Cuba, Venezuela. So,
yes, and
30 seconds or less. No, I'm kidding. All the time you want.
So you read that at the Latin American, yeah. But I'm still a charge. I'm not yet an ambassador. So, but yes, we're having discussion. This is not a secret. As you know, a few days before the summit in Panama, that's public, a special envoy from Secretary Kerry came to Caracas. And then during the summit in Panama, there was an informal meeting or conversation between President Obama and President Maduro for 15 minutes. I mean, again, that was public. I mean, not public the meeting, but being reported. And we are talking. Something very important. It's true that a few days before the summit, President Obama did recognize that he doesn't regard Venezuela as a threat. That was quite important to say, and at least to admit. So, we are talking, and hopefully in the next few weeks, we might have some things to show and to say to the world. But yes, it might be a contradiction in one way, we all celebrate the end of this last chapter of the Cold War, when President Obama and President Raul Castro, they did announce on the 17th of December the normalization of the relation, and we all celebrate that. I think it's very important to put an end to this situation that lasted for nearly 60 years. But then it will be a bit strange, a bit weird, a bit sad, to say the least, that then suddenly you open another chapter not quite nice with my country, So that's the reason it's very important for all of you and for all of us to keep an eye on that and be on alert. But as President Maduro said, we support that process of normalization between the US and Cuba. And we recognize the courage and of President Obama to have done that. And apparently next week we're going to start again to talk, and very soon we might have ambassadors, a Cuban ambassador in Washington and a US ambassador in Havana. I hope that I can be their colleagues. Cuban. About Puerto Rico, as I said to you, it was my first visit in Chicago, and this morning I went to Humboldt Park. Humboldt Park? Yes. And I was there, and I saw an amazing flag, I never see something like that. I thought it was a sculpture, but they told me, no, it is a Puerto Rican flag, You know the one?
Over the street, at the
Yes.
entrance to Puerto Rico.
Yeah. It's very...
Puerto Rican territory.
So yes, and they told me, yes, you are here in a very interesting place. So I went there. I went to a restaurant called Nelly. You know?
Yeah.
Interesting. I have the best hot meal with cocoa milk. And I have an interesting discussion with people there. Puerto Rico was invited in the CELAC summit. And yes, we follow the situation very closely. All the region, and we see what happens in the near future. But it was very interesting to see that Puerto Rico was there at the CELAC summit. I'm a diplomat, I'm supposed to No more questions?
Questions? Yes, ma'am. Yes, go ahead.
In the spirit of solidarity, we know that the U.S. had a meeting yesterday, and it seems that there's an overwhelming approval of the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. So in the spirit of solidarity, would it be possible that Venezuela and the region within Central and South America would be helping expose the effect of the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement? Because for the Philippines, my country, the Philippines, will be the launching pad later of the Asian table. And there was already an announcement that there is a big possibility that the Subic naval base will again be opened in the north. Of course, China is in the north. And in the south, the airfield, which is like 30 minutes or 45 minutes from my father's house, will be used as an airfield in Mindanao, where we have the continuous presence of U.S. Marines, like less than 1,000 troops, all over the Philippines. And Japan and the U.S. are in partnership with this possibility of having the U.S. base again. And so this is very detrimental to the Filipino people. And the detriment of the Filipino people is the detriment of many peoples of the world, because this is again a very clear example of how, U.S. foreign policy is like bullying a country like ours, which used to be occupied and now still a semi-colony of the U.S. So would we be hearing solidarity support from Venezuela and regions within it?
Good. Yes, right in the back.
I have a pragmatic question. I'm actually not from Chicago, I'm from Toledo, Ohio, and I'm just here for the week. But in March, we started for the first time ever on UC's campus solidarity organization with Venezuela called the Friends of Venezuela Society. And it's the first time we've ever had anything like it on UC's campus. So one of the peculiar dynamics of our campus, though, is that we have a small group of Venezuelan students who aren't very friendly to us, and we don't actually have any Venezuelan students in our organization. So we often get shut down in the sense that they say, well, look, you're not from our country, you can't talk about it, et cetera, and these are the sort of arguments, these sort of arguments that really harm us in that sense, and when they have their cousins from Venezuela post on our page about how we shouldn't be talking about it. And so that's one of the issues we're running into as a solidarity organization, is the sort of identity politics that we can't actually confront. So I guess my one question is, how do we, what some advice or some suggestions, how do we deal with that? And then secondly, are these sort of campus-based solidarity organizations a good way to approach solidarity work? What's the best way to go about it, I guess? Just some pragmatic questions.
Another question? I just wanted to speak to this because I think it would be difficult for somebody that's a Venezuelan citizen representing the Venezuelan government to make suggestions to a solidarity committee in the United States. But I think I can speak. I think I could speak to that. And I would. Stansfield Smith standing in the back. There's a Chicago committee, and I think that you should talk with some people from the Chicago committee. I'm in a very small. Hammond, Indiana. I'm not from Chicago either, but I would say they're right. You're not from Venezuela, but they're not from the United States. We know more about what our government does and what our government is capable of than anybody else does. And we have a responsibility as American citizens to stand for the things that we've been raised to believe in, even if our government doesn't. So whether someone wants our act of solidarity or not is not really the issue, because we're more aware of what the U.S. is capable of. I would also suggest that what you said before about the Venezuelan students that are at the University of Toledo probably don't represent the general population of Venezuela. And I'd be happy to talk to you more about that afterwards, because we find ourselves in the same situation. Yes. The other question, you can answer it too. I just didn't want to put you in. I didn't want to put him on the spot.
No. I was going to say I'm not from Chicago. but no, you can invite me. With great pleasure I could come to Toledo. But then you helped me to confront. About the Philippines, you see. What took place in Latin America in the last 10 years is a clear example that something else is different from all the neoliberal policies that have been taking place in most of the world in the last 20, 30 years. and to show that yes, something different can take place where people become the core of policies. This idea that the economic policies should serve the people and not the other way. An example where to show that it is very important to have a state to respond to the need of the people. So I think the best way to right now is to express to respond to your question is, just look at what happens in Latin America in the last 10, 15 years, and maybe that could be part of the solution. But I think that's the reason we said Venezuela is not a threat. Venezuela is a hope, in the sense that yes, we are going through a difficult moment. That's for sure. It's not easy to change a society. It's not easy to transform a society, but it's possible. And as long as you respond to the need and the demands of the people. And so that's how we'll answer to you. We might not satisfy you.
Another question? Yes.
When Joe was asking before about the NED in Venezuela, Eva Gollinger was the person to read about that. She goes into that in great detail. She had some recent article in the Counterpunch magazine at counterpunch.org. I think she said between 2000 and 2011, the U.S. had, through these agencies like NED, spent $120 million in Venezuela. I don't know that's as a whole. And our committee in Chicago that organized this event, we don't have any Venezuelans in it either. But we are really we're against U.S. interference in Venezuela. That's what we're about. And we're against the media campaign against disinformation against Venezuela. That's sufficient.
I guess my question would be, what are you hopeful?
What, I'm sorry?
Because I'm a college student, I don't really know much about the history of Venezuelan country, and I'm not from the United States, but I grew up here, and for me, it's still, I'm very unaware of what is going on, so for me, my question is, if you're not a threat, then what are you hopeful for?
What's Venezuela hope for?
What we hope for?
What do you represent for
That's the most difficult question I get tonight and for the last few weeks. Well, first, we are trying to build a more decent society in Venezuela, a more equal society, where people can get access to free education, free health, no matter their background, no matter from who their parents are. Equal opportunities is what we are trying to do. And a more decent society, yes. Where if you take a picture of Venezuela 20 years ago, 30 years ago, and now, just the street of Caracas, you see how things have changed. People, just look at a rally if you take a picture of a Chavez rally, of Maduro rally, you will see that most of the people who goes there, the color of their skin. And then you take a picture of a rally of the opposition, they look more like mine. My family, they don't understand why I'm on this side. But hope for, and with the United States, we hope that we can find a better way to deal with our differences, to learn to live a kind of pacific coexistence. Maybe we can agree on some issue. We might disagree on others, but at least to find a way to handle them, and through discussion and dialogue, and not through confrontation and threat. I think that's what we hope for. And again, to leave our people to decide their future. If tomorrow the Venezuelan opposition get the majority of the votes, well, I can guarantee you that my president will be the first to accept the result and to resign. But first we need to get that. Yeah, thank you very much for your question.
You spoke a little about economic sabotage. I was wondering, is there much resistance by the skilled workers in the oil field? As I think was the case earlier during the time of Sanchez.
Yeah.
Any more questions?
If you're talking about the summit, the inclusion of Puerto Rico and, Obama, the way he tried to preempt the agenda by declaring Venezuela a threat and, basically no one else was on board with it. Do you think that kind of a underlying message there was, the last 2 centuries or so of the Monroe Doctrine are done?
Yeah, my question is, I don't know if it's an easy one to answer, but obviously there's a difference between our countries in that our military, our budgeting or spending on military things is just out of control, and we barely have any social spending. I'm wondering, in percentage-wise, can you kind of talk about that in your country, because I think there's a huge difference, I think, in terms of where the money goes here.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's the same way you see it there, but.
Mm-hmm. So about the economic sabotage and the oil industry, you have to remember that after the attempted coup, the failed coup in 2002, a few months later, there was, a strike from the oil industry. Not only from the oil industry, it was amazing. Usually when you have a strike that takes place, for me, I'm very proud to be here in Chicago because of the 1st of May and the Haymarket. And, usually you think workers, they go on strike to fight for their rights and for, but in Venezuela it was the,
Management.
Yes, the
Lockout.
Yeah, lockout from, decided by the
CEOs.
The CEOs, by the chairmen, by the los patrones. So that was strange, because suddenly we decided to lock up, to close the factories, to close the shops, to close the markets, to close the restaurants. And yes, PDVSA, our national company, oil company. And can you imagine, for nearly 2 months, it was a big battle, and not a single oil was produced. And not only that, they did sabotage most of our installation. Some of our refineries plants, some of our, And I think, can you imagine workers were, not workers, sorry, whites, what do you said?
White collar.
Yeah. With their computer trying to play around and to sabotage the refinery plant. This is what exactly took place in Venezuela during these months. That was in 2002, 2003. A difficult moment, but we won. And we did recover PDVSA and our industry at that moment. After a long battle, but then not a single dollar get in Venezuela during all these days. It was a difficult moment. And I think more than 15,000 people from PDVSA, they left PDVSA after the sabotage. And then we didn't do too bad without them. But it was a very tricky moment. And now, when I was talking about economic sabotage, when you look at history, and the best way to promote discontent within a population, again, promote shortages and get difficult access to the dollars in the market, When you read the financial press, they keep saying that Venezuela is on the edge of a default, sorry. They've been saying that for the last 10 years. And it's not the case. The other question was, sorry? Yes, so I remember President Chavez was always talking about two different concepts of America, of the Monroe Doctrine and Bolivar Doctrine. But I think Secretary Kerry said a few months ago that the Monroe Doctrine was over. So, no, I mean, Secretary Kerry said so, No, I have a lot of respect for him. No, really. So, yeah. We see, again, this summit in Panama, again, was historical. We are talking about, for the first time, all the region were together. So we could say that was the first real summit of the Americas. The first one. And thanks to all of us, including the United States, to have accepted the president of Cuba.
Military spending.
Huh?
Military spending.
Military spending. Yes. I know that. So I don't have with me the figure. How much you would like to know? How much we spend?
No, it's kind of like a percentage thing. I mean, obviously we're different sized countries, different things going on, but and it's
I'm
different.
looking at my.
Different ways than
60% of the budget goes into social spending of some sort.
Okay, well, that's already a huge difference. Yeah.
The opposite.
Yes.
One more question.
Can I do it? You talked about hope of diversifying the economy.
Yeah.
In regards to the fact that oil needs to be left in the ground because of climate change, can you address the issue of climate change, how it's projected to impact Venezuela and South America, and the directions or the means of diversifying that you see taking place?
I'm from Venezuela, and when I left Venezuela 22 years ago, I know that one of our concerns was our international debt, the IMF, and my understanding is that Chavez was able to pay off and free us from that debt. And recently what I've heard is a concern about the debt that we have with China now. And I want you to appease my fears that now we're not indebted to another big empire for the many years to come. And you mentioned that one of our fallouts of being an oil country is that we need to import everything, that it's cheaper to buy than to produce. But I believe that when we lose farmers, when we lose the knowledge of knowing how to even grow in our own land, we really lose more at the end.
Yes.
And so I'm just hoping that Venezuela uses all these revenue from the oil to grow our country, sembrar el petróleo, for a strong future and not becoming indebted now to other resources, other sources of
getting serious. Now we're talking about economy.
Okay.
I'm from Brazil, and you said that you work there.
Yes, I love Brazil.
Okay, that's good.
Where do you come from, Brazil?
São Paulo.
São Paulo, Paulista.
Yeah, exactly. So, I don't know if you know, you probably know that, but like the recent elections from last year, they were even like, they were 10% difference between the two presidents.
Yes.
It was really little, even like in Venezuela probably, I think. And there are riots, there were riots, like, not riots, but there were protests.
Yes, in São Paulo particularly.
Yeah. But it didn't get as much as media attention as like Venezuela. Probably because, I don't know, they were not as violent or not. And, but it's true, our president was reelected. I know that they have a very good relationship, right? Like Venezuela and Brazil right now with the president.
No. We have excellent relations, yes.
Yeah, they have very good relationship.
Yeah.
And our president kind of goes, she's not socialist, but she goes more with like the idea that to invest more in like.
She's a progressive.
Yeah, exactly. So do you think the United States is more worried about Venezuela because they're stronger about it, and like they didn't even care, like nobody cares about what's happening in Brazil that much, but Venezuela, they put such a strong emphasis in it, even though it happens in other countries.
Okay, I'm gonna start with
like a socialist threat.
Yes, no, it's interesting what you're saying, but I mean, you mentioned the attention of the media, but remember that a few months after the election, I can't remember when it was, I think 3 months ago, you have some demonstration that took place in all Brazil, and particularly in São Paulo and everywhere. And all the media, they were showing pictures and people like, we want a coup. Yes, no, I mean, it was very strange. And there was one, I love Bahia.
They wanted to separate them.
But but Salvador de Bahia, 70% of the population is Afro. And there was a picture of the demonstration of that day in Salvador de Bahia, and you thought it was Sweden. Yes. But the point is, obviously, Brazil is like a continent. It's huge, and it's very important for all Latin America.
So they cannot do anything. They cannot.
Not exactly, but that is different because the size and what Brazil represents. You're part of the BRICS, part of this new world that we are trying to build, the 21st century. Brazil is a very important player. So obviously, things are different, but when I read the news, some of my friends in Brazil, they said to me, wow, it seems that the Brazilian opposition has been learning a lot from the Venezuelan opposition.
Yeah, that's where, that's...
So, yeah, but it's an interesting process as well. I mean, what took place in Brazil in the last 10 years is very interesting as well. About the economy, what I was saying that, and I think your question is
similar.
Yes. The difference between the IMF and the Chinese, that there's no precondition. You don't have a kind of, there's not a Beijing consensus to follow. That's the difference with the IMF. The IMF allows to give, Huh?
Demands.
No, yes, they are very good. Yes,
Conditionality.
demands, and then they tell, oh, you're a good student, you're a bad student, you know. And
Grades.
Yeah, great, rates. And then you got Christine Lagarde who said, oh, I'm very worried about blah, blah, blah. You never hear that from somebody from China or whatever, you know. So I think that's a big difference, that we have excellent relation with China. We a strong partnership, but you know, it's not that we are trying to change from one, you know, as you're saying. I mean, I don't think so. I think it's still quite different. And about the economy, again, it's what we are trying to do. As you said yourself, yes, El Petrol, you know, the oil, create this this dependency, and we lost people in our farmers, you know, because it was far more attractive to go to the cities and to the towns and to get an easy job maybe than really to work. And that took place in the 20th century in Venezuela, no? El éxodo rural. And again, one of our problems in Venezuela, we didn't have a proper, what do we say, bourgeois entrepreneur, you know, bourgeoisie, producer, yeah. They just import. They've just been importing, and thanks to the state, actually. It's not like in Brazil, for example, or Argentina, that you have a kind of bourgeoisie that started to develop their own means of production. And that was not the case of Venezuela. And that's been one of the problems. And what we're trying to do in the last 15 years with Chavez and now with President Maduro, of course, is to diversify our economy and trying to not to depend only on our oil industry and the price of the barrel. But it's quite difficult. And when you look at all countries or producers, it's not easy at all. But that's what we're trying to do. And one of the reasons why we are promoting integration, because we do believe that, yes, complementing each other, with Brazil, for example, with Argentina, with Ecuador, we will be able to respond and ways to diversify our economy. Well, I mean that Venezuela could produce many, many things to the north of Brazil, for example. So that's what we're trying to do. But it's a difficult task.
When I hear the questions, it strikes me that this crowd is as knowledgeable as the United States Congress. Your questions are well informed. It's 8:30, and would you stay for talk? If we want to have other questions, Jesus Rodriguez is here, Carlos Ron is here from the consulate. The ambassador will stay, so you can have other questions. I just felt like I wanted to respond to her question for hope. I keep looking at the clock, and it strikes me, since we started to this minute, 30,000 kids have starved to death in the world. That doesn't have to be. The richest 435 people in the United States have as much wealth as the 90% of the rest of us. They don't have homeless people in Cuba. They don't have people without medicine in Cuba. They don't pay for college in Chile or Denmark or Sweden. That's hope for a better future. Venezuela may have problems, but Venezuela has taken what Cuba started to another step. We, as American people, could take it to a step that would change human history and our relationship to the environment. That's a hope, and that's inspirational. And we can't answer all the questions here, and I wouldn't ask a diplomat from any country to tell us everything. I would say you could go to venezuelaanalysis.com as a start, get some material off of the back. I see that Professor Felix Massoud is here. A round of applause thanking him for doing this. And that was a tepid applause. Let's have a larger applause for a man that should be the ambassador to the United States.